So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final week on our exploration of Bhante's levels of awareness. I'm going to start with just a quick recap on the ground that we've already covered before we start to look at awareness of reality. So we have these four levels. This is Bhante's interpretation, if you like, of the more traditional teaching of the Satipatthana practice. So we start with awareness of things, and Atulimati took us through that week, awareness of the world around us, awareness of our environment, both natural and the built-up environment, and awareness of things in their arising and passing away. And then we had awareness of self, with Stiranaga taking us on a little exploration of ourselves, our responses, our reactions. And last week we looked at awareness of people, particularly how our awareness of people is distorted by our own perception, our own conditioning, our own prejudices, our own views, and how difficult it is to actually see people simply as they are. And all of that really ties in with what we're going to be doing this week, which is looking at awareness of reality, awareness of things as they are. Sangharakshita in his book, The Noble Eightfold Path, on the section on right mindfulness, which is where this teaching on the four levels is to be found, he speaks about how this is the most difficult level of awareness for us to develop. So in a sense, the other levels of awareness were preparing us for this week, and we're going to try and engage with something which is by its very nature almost impossible for us to do. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. So Bhante describes awareness of reality as a direct, non-discursive contemplation. So if I was to follow that through, then there's nothing more for me to say. We'll just sit and engage in a non-discursive contemplation of reality. But unfortunately, of course, it isn't that simple, because it immediately raises the question of, well, what is it that we're contemplating? You know, you can tell us, Silanatha, to sit here in contemplation, but contemplation of what? So hopefully I can go a little way towards answering that question this morning. Now, we could get lost very easily in a deep philosophical debate about the nature of reality, but we're not going down that road, principally because it won't take us anywhere useful. Philosophers have been discussing and arguing and proposing their answers to that question for millennia, and they're still no nearer. They'd be a lot closer if they just took a Buddhist course on a Saturday morning, I think, but there we go. So we're not going down the route of a philosophical debate. In fact, the Buddha himself took great care to avoid such debates. The Buddha was renowned for his refusal to get drawn into metaphysical discussions because he could see that they served no purpose. They didn't resolve any of the issues that were important. The Buddha's approach was always pragmatic. He was concerned with getting us to examine, to question, to investigate our own direct experience and to draw our conclusions from that, not to get into a hypothetical debate about something that really wasn't relevant to the job of liberating ourselves from our experience of dukkha, from being trapped on this endless cycle of experiencing dukkha, dissatisfaction, pain, suffering. So how did the Buddha speak about awareness of reality? Well, I think probably the most useful definition we can come up with from certainly from the Pali Canon is that awareness of reality is knowledge and vision of things as they really are. So knowledge and vision of things as they really are. So this is not meant to be taken as an intellectual understanding or knowing. It's not meant to be taken of seeing as we see in the everyday sense of seeing the world or things around us. It's an awareness that goes beyond conceptual formulation. It goes beyond description and explanation. We just have to know and see our experience as it really is. Quite a simple instruction, but not so easy to do, of course. So how is this knowing and seeing different to the way that we already know and see things? We all know things, we all see things, we are aware of the world around us to varying degrees, the material world, other people, to some extent, the wider expanse of the universe. To some degree, we may even be aware of ourselves. But it's not so much about what we see, but how we see it that's important. We see all these things, we have some awareness of them, but how do we see them? And the real problem is that unfortunately we don't see these things, we don't see anything as it really is. And the Buddha taught us that in fact our tendency is to see things in completely the wrong way. Now we may find that quite challenging. We may even react to that and say, well, you know, I'm pretty sure I've got a good grasp on things. I know what's going on. You know, no one pulls the wool over my eyes. I can see things as they are. But actually we don't, is the honest truth of it. We don't see things as they really are. So we're going to do a little exercise now, just something that will bring that home, I hope, in a fairly basic way. So we're going to have a look at a slide. It's a slide of a sunset. And I just want you to spend a moment or two just looking at that slide, looking at that image, and just putting yourself into that picture. So let's just imagine we're standing perhaps on a sand dune or at the top of a low cliff, standing above the beach, looking out to sea. It's late evening. The sun's low in the sky, just a few little clouds. There's no wind. It's warm. It's peaceful. There's nothing disturbing us. It's just us and the view in front of us. So when we've taken that image in, I want you to just gently close your eyes, hold that image in your mind with your eyes closed. And now just try to be aware of your perception of that scene. Not thinking about it, just being aware of your direct perception. And as we look at the sun, the bottom edge of the sun just kissing the horizon, and after a little while we notice that the bottom edge of the sun is no longer visible. It's started to go down, it's dropped below the horizon. And the longer we stand here looking at the sun, the lower it sinks below the horizon. Now, just the top half of the sun is visible to us. And a few moments later, 3/4 of the sun has dropped below the horizon. And now only the very top edge of the sun is still visible. And then that too disappears below the horizon. And all we're left with is the afterglow in the western sky. And that too gradually darkens as night falls upon us. Okay, so you can open your eyes now. I think we're done with that slide. Thank you, Stiranaga. So let's bring ourselves back to Colchester on a Saturday morning with the wind blowing. Now, I'm going to take a guess here that if you manage to keep your rational thinking mind at bay during that exercise, what you perceived was the sun dropping down in the sky and eventually dipping below the horizon and disappearing from view. What you perceived was the sun moving whilst you were standing there looking at it. Now, I know we all know that that isn't what was happening. Fortunately, because of several hundred years of development of scientific thought and understanding, we can all explain what was really happening in that situation. But what we perceived was the same as every human being that's ever lived has perceived when they looked at the sunset, and was firmly held as a true fact of how things are, that the sun was moving down below the horizon, that we were fixed and still. We were watching something else that was moving. Now, nowadays, of course, we know that's not true. We know that the sun is the fixed reference point for us here in this part of the universe, and that it's us that was moving, or the world rather, that was moving and carrying us with it. It was rotating, completing a full 360-degree rotation every 24 hours. And that far from standing still, we were actually rushing through space at great speed, although we couldn't detect that. We had no direct sense of the rotation of the Earth, so to us the Earth is a fixed point, and all heavenly objects move around it. And that view, to question that view would have been heresy and could have got you burnt at the stake 500 years ago. But now we know it as a fact. So even on a direct everyday experience like a sunset, and our language still reinforces that view. We talk of sunset and the sun going down. Actually, it's not. So we got that wrong. Our perceptions are wrong. We now have an intellectual understanding that counteracts that perceptual misunderstanding. So a very trivial example, but that's the kind of thing that goes on all the time at every level of our experience, that we can't rely on our perceptions. I've had people challenge me before and say to me, well, that was my experience, you can't question it. I said, no, I can't question your experience, but I can and will question your perception of your experience, because that's where the fault lies. That's where we get it wrong. So the Buddha taught that there were 4 ways in which we get things wrong. The technical name runs the 4 viparyasas, but let's just call them the 4 wrong views. It's a bit easier. So we see the impermanent as permanent. We see the unpleasant as pleasant. We see the insubstantial as substantial, and we see the ugly as beautiful. Now, I'd really love to spend a lot of time going through these. They really deserve a lot of time, but unfortunately, we just don't have the time this morning to go into these in any great detail. But it's something to reflect on, that we see things in completely the wrong way. Not just now and again. This is our basic way of operating, that we relate to things as if they were permanent when they're not. We relate to things as pleasant when they're not. We see things as having some real self-existence, which they don't. And we see things as beautiful when, in fact, they're not. This is a relative term, by the way. This last one, we should be aware. The Buddha was quite clearly, as he makes clear in many suttas, he's not saying that there is nothing beautiful in the world, but it's all relative. The beauty that we see in our conditioned existence around us is no longer beautiful when seen in the light of transcendental vision, when we see something that is far, far more beautiful. So yeah, beauty is a relative term. This is the message of that last one. So we see things from the viewpoint of a fixed and permanent me. And we see that me as the subject of all of our experience. Or to put that another way, to use a phrase we're probably all familiar with, at a deep emotional level, we really do think that we are the center of the universe. Now, I know we tend to bandy that phrase around and particularly direct it at someone who's behaving very selfishly. But in fact, that phrase applies to each and every one of us. We do see ourselves as the center of our universe. We see everything revolving around us, and we as the one fixed permanent point of reference in the middle of all of that experience. And that's where we go wrong. So how do we change the way that we see things? Well, there are two ways of looking at this, of making this change, or two ways of approaching it. One way is through words, ideas, and concepts. And we have no end of these. In fact, the Buddha used words and concepts throughout his teaching. His Dharma is, if you like, the conceptualization of his enlightenment experience, as much as that experience can be put into concepts. And some of these concepts that we're most familiar with are things like conditioned co-production. So I'm going to skip through these quite quickly because I don't have time to go into any great detail, but conditioned co-production, the teaching that everything arises on the basis of conditions, summed up in this little verse that you may well be familiar with: this being that becomes, from the arising of this that arises, this not being that does not become, from the ceasing of this that ceases. So there's a conceptual embodiment of the teaching of reality, of the way things are. Okay, it's not a definition, it's just a way of trying to point us in the right direction. And then we have the Four Noble Truths. So the truth that all of our experience is tied in with dukkha, with unsatisfactoriness, with suffering. The truth that that dukkha has its origins in our craving, our desire for things to be other than they are. The truth that we can bring that to an end. We don't have to be stuck with that experience of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness. And the truth of the path that achieves that, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, which you may be familiar with. And finally, from a conceptual point of view, we'll look at the three characteristics of conditioned existence. So this is the Buddha's description of what it's really like to be a human being in this conditioned world, living a conditioned existence. So all conditioned things are impermanent. Everything changes. An important thing about this this one, I think, worth bringing to our attention now, is that to say that all conditioned things are impermanent doesn't mean that conditioned things exist for a while and then they end. So, you know, we are impermanent. We're going to live for X number of years and then we will die. It's actually much more profound than that. This teaching that all conditioned things are impermanent tells us that nothing is fixed for even an instant. Everything is in a continuous state of flux, a continuous process of change. Everything arises and it changes, and it continues to change until it ceases. That applies for everything we see around us. It applies most importantly to us and everything about us, and not just our physical being, but everything about the mind, everything about our emotional being, our heart, everything about us that we know that we can experience is impermanent and constantly changing, constantly arising, constantly passing away. So all conditioned things are dukkha, all conditioned things are bound up with pain, dissatisfaction, and suffering. That's not to deny that there are pleasant things in the world. We all know that there are pleasant things in the world. But for us, the pain that's tied up even with the pleasant things is, of course, that they have to come to an end because they're impermanent. And we don't want them to come to an end. So even our pleasures are tied up with dissatisfaction and pain. And all things are empty of a self. A bit of shorthand there, because what we're really talking about is empty of a fixed, permanent, unchanging essence. To put it perhaps quite succinctly, that in all of our experience, there is no experiencer, there is just the experience. Again, I can't do anything like justice to any of these in the 20 minutes or so that we've got this morning. So there are limitations to these concepts, of course. The Buddha taught us that the Dharma, the truth, was subtle and beyond reason. So it's beyond conceptual thought. So we have to recognize that these ideas and concepts can only take us so far. And there'll come a point when we have to abandon the concepts in order to embrace, to become aware of reality as it really is. But until we reach that point, we need to make intelligent use of the ideas and concepts that the Buddha used in his teaching. And the analogy of the raft, you may have come across this, that the Buddha taught the Dharma as a raft. The Dharma is a tool to get us to the other side, to get us to that point of realization. It's not something to be hung on to when it's served its purpose. It's not something to be made beautiful and revered and polished and decorated and made comfortable, but never used for its real purpose. So the Dharma serves a purpose, and it can get us a long, long way. I'd almost certainly say much further than we've progressed so far. So it would be a bit premature to abandon the raft just at the moment. As well as concepts and ideas, there is an alternative, or another, I won't say an alternative, there is another way of approaching this sense of developing an awareness of reality, and that's through images. This way, we can perhaps think of as bypassing the thinking mind and going straight to the heart. Connecting with the heart, just opening ourselves to the image or the symbol and all that it represents, and just allowing that to suffuse our being, to fill us. And the classical image, of course, is the image of the Buddha. So we can, as it were, just dwell on the image of the Buddha, just bringing to mind, as best we can, our sense of the Buddha as a man wandering around in India 2,500 years ago, striving to find the answer to what is this life all about? What's the meaning? What's the purpose of life? And of dedicating himself to finding that answer, no matter what the cost to him personally. And of eventually, of course, breaking through to that realization that we call enlightenment. And then bringing to mind the Buddha teaching, 45 years trying to communicate that experience, to show the way to others. All of the spiritual qualities that the Buddha embodied, his wisdom, his compassion, his strength, his determination, all of those qualities that we can imagine embodied in that figure of the Buddha, and just holding that in mind and just allowing that sense of all that the Buddha was to permeate our own being. Another way, perhaps a little more straightforward, is mantra. And we have here the Shakyamuni mantra. It's not the only one, of course, and Mantras speak to us in different ways, but the mantra embodies in sound the qualities of the Buddha. It embodies them if we are aware, or to whatever extent that we are aware of those qualities. Just reciting, chanting to ourselves the mantra can turn our mind to those qualities, can tune us in, as it were, to that wavelength, the wavelength on which those spiritual qualities are to be found. And repetition of the mantra becomes part of our being if we do it often enough. The mantra just arises in our minds without us consciously making an effort to do so, without us deciding that we're going to chant a mantra. We can often just find ourselves with the mantra running through our minds. And that's a way of engaging with reality, because the images of the Buddha and the sounds of the mantra are embodiments of the Buddha's nature, and that nature of the Buddha is reality, which is what we're trying to become aware of. So most of us will have a preference for one approach over the other. That's quite natural. Some of us will naturally relate to concepts and ideas. Others of us will naturally relate to images and symbols. That's why we have more than one way of approaching this. But simply because we have a natural tendency towards one approach doesn't mean that we should necessarily just ignore the other approach. We need to broaden ourselves out a bit, as it were, to become more balanced. And we can do that by engaging, making the effort to engage with the approach perhaps that we don't feel such a natural affinity for. So if we find it easy to engage with our head, then let's put in the effort to engage our heart. If you find it quite natural to engage from the heart, well, don't dismiss engaging with the head, but try that as well. So just to sum up, I'd like to read a verse from the Heart Sutra. Now, this verse, when I first heard it, sent what I can best describe as an electric shock down the length of my spine. I didn't understand it. I had no idea what it was about, but something about it just told me that there was deep truth and profound meaning in this verse. And it's been like that ever since. I could say that I do understand to some extent what the verse is saying now, but it continues to inspire me, continues to electrify me when I'm really engaged with it. So I'm going to read it out, and I just want you to hear the words, to absorb the words. Don't think about them. Don't try to attach meaning to them. Just absorb the words. So know that the Bodhisattva, holding to nothing whatever, but dwelling in prajna wisdom, is freed of delusive hindrance, rid of the fear bred by it, and reaches clearest nirvana. Okay, so I think that's an appropriate point to end this morning's talk. Thank you.